Nick Reiner was born into the very epicenter of American culture, raised under the warm, golden glow of Hollywood royalty, where power, fame, and money are often mistaken for armor against the tragedies of ordinary life. For decades, the Reiner name was synonymous with laughter and cinematic brilliance, a legacy built on storytelling that touched the hearts of millions. Inside their private world, Rob and Michelle Reiner attempted to script a different kind of story for their son, one of redemption and unconditional love. They constructed a fortress of support around Nick, believing that their immense resources, the hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into elite rehabilitation programs, and their unwavering open-door policy could somehow insulate him from the cracks forming in his psyche. Even as recently as earlier this year, they welcomed him back into their Brentwood sanctuary, clinging to the desperate hope that as long as the family remained united, Nick could still be saved from himself. But the protective bubble of wealth and influence is fragile, and when it finally burst, it did not shatter quietly. It collapsed in a way that no scriptwriter could have conceived, turning a home of legacy into a house of horrors. Today, the narrative has shifted from Hollywood prestige to a grim cell in a Los Angeles jail where Nick Reiner sits accused of the unthinkable, the murder of his own parents, inside the very mansion that was supposed to be his safe haven. The details emerging from the indictment are not just tragic. They are visceral enough to send a chill down the spine of the most hardened investigator. The prosecution alleges that in the dead of night, while Rob and Michelle lay in the absolute vulnerability of sleep, Nick unleashed a torrent of violence that defies comprehension. He is accused of repeatedly attacking them with a knife, slashing at their necks and chests, with a ferocity that suggests this was not merely a physical struggle, but an attempt to obliterate the past. This was not a scene of accidental passion or a brief, impulsive mistake. It was a tableau of brutality that haunts the soul. Following the carnage, Nick did not call for help. He fled, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than death itself. When he was finally apprehended, the public was expecting to see a monster raving in madness, but instead they were met with a demeanor that was arguably more terrifying, calm, detached, and completely devoid of visible emotion. As Nick now sits behind bars, represented by Alan Jackson, one of the nation's most formidable defense attorneys, paid for, ironically, by the very fortune his parents built, we are forced to ask a terrifying question. Is Nick Reiner truly a cold-blooded, remorseless killer who turned on his creators? Or is this bloody climax merely the final, inevitable act of a slow-burning tragedy that we, the public, were too dazzled by the Hollywood lights to see clearly? To understand the horror of that morning, we must first look back at the warning signs that were screaming in plain sight just hours before the first drop of blood was spilled. These accounts become even more unsettling when placed alongside the events that transpired just one single night before the murders at a glittering Christmas party hosted at the home of late-night legend Conan O'Brien. The gathering was the epitome of Hollywood exclusivity, a room filled with laughter, champagne, and cultural icons like Jane Fonda and Bill Hader. However, Nick Reiner was never on the official guest list. He was brought along by his parents, not as a guest, but effectively as a prisoner of their own love and terrifying anxiety. For weeks leading up to that night, Nick had been spiraling, mentally unstable, unpredictable, and ghost-like in his own home. Bringing him to the party was a desperate tactical maneuver born of fear. The fear of leaving him unsupervised, the fear that if they loosened their grip for even a second, the darkness would swallow him whole. Yet stepping into that room of celebration, Nick did not blend in. He stood out like a fracture in a perfect painting. Instead of socializing, he wandered the room with a haunting detachment, approaching guests with a repetitive, almost robotic intensity that left the Hollywood elite deeply unnerved. The atmosphere shifted from festive to suffocating as Nick began asking bizarre, boundary-crossing questions, demanding to know guests' full names and bluntly asking, "Are you famous?" It was behavior that made him seem less like the son of a celebrated director and more like a stranger who had wandered in off the street, completely untethered from social norms. The tension crystallized in a disturbing encounter with actor Bill Hader. Nick abruptly inserted himself into Hader's private conversation, his eyes fixed and unblinking, and delivered his strange interrogation. When Hader politely tried to deflect, Nick didn't just walk away. He stood there staring in a heavy, silent confrontation before storming off in a burst of inexplicable anger. But the night's true breaking point came when the private tragedy of the Reiner family spilled out into public view. Rob and Nick became locked in a fierce, loud argument, their voices rising above the holiday music, turning a discreet family disagreement into a frozen spectacle of shock for everyone in the room. Humiliated and exhausted, Rob and Michelle apologized to Conan O'Brien and fled the party early, retreating back to the isolation of their Brentwood home. That hasty exit would be the final time the Reiner family was ever seen together in public, a tragic curtain call where the warning signs were not just visible, they were screaming, yet no one could have predicted that the anger simmering in that party room was about to boil over into absolute devastation. The most haunting aspect of this case lies not just in the outcome, but in the chillingly ruthless method with which the crime was carried out, a sequence of events that unfolded in the heavy, suffocating silence of the early morning. According to investigative details that have since pierced the veil of privacy, the tragedy occurred in the deepest hours of darkness on December 14, 2025, inside the Reiner family's estate in the otherwise tranquil neighborhood of Brentwood. At that hour, the world outside was still, and inside the master bedroom, Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, were asleep in their familiar bed, a private sanctuary long associated with safety and rest. There were no signs of a struggle, no desperate cries for help recorded by neighbors, only a fragile, fleeting moment in which two human beings were at their most vulnerable. At approximately 4:00 a.m., while the house breathed the quiet rhythm of sleep, Nick Reiner reportedly left his room, a knife already gripped in his hand. He moved silently through the darkened hallway, advancing step by step toward his parents' door with a terrifying lack of hesitation. What happened next was not a chaotic scuffle, but a methodical execution. While both victims were still deeply asleep, unaware that their son was standing over them, the attack began. Information leaked from the preliminary investigation indicates that the bodies exhibited a horrific tapestry of violence, multiple types of sharp force injuries, including deep stab wounds and long severing slashes to the necks and chests. In the cold language of forensic science, this distinction is crucial. Stab wounds typically require force and depth, while slashes are superficial but cover more surface area. The simultaneous presence of both suggests that this assault did not occur in a single frenzied second. Instead, forensic experts suggest it likely involved a sequence of repeated controlled actions where the attacker had to shift body weight, maintain sustained pressure, and draw the blade across the victims over a specific period of time. This was an act that required not only physical strength, but also a chillingly resolute determination to see the task through to its bloody end. The cruelty here lies not in speed, but in duration. To follow through with such an act, the perpetrator must sustain their lethal intent without interruption, without faltering, and without mercy. Following the massacre, the house fell silent once more, holding its gruesome secret until later that afternoon when the couple's daughter, Romy Reiner, arrived to discover a scene that marked the violent end of a Hollywood legend and the beginning of a nightmare that the world is still struggling to comprehend. After the violence of the night had subsided into a terrified silence, Nick Reiner did not panic. He did not speed away in a frenzy of adrenaline or desperation. Instead, he simply walked away, drifting into the anonymity of the Los Angeles morning, like a ghost detaching itself from the living world. 6 hours after the discovery of the bodies, police tracked him to a location approximately 15 miles from the crime scene near the bustling campus of the University of Southern California. It was here that surveillance footage captured images that are terrifying not because of any overt aggression, but because of their absolute chilling normality. In the grainy video frames later obtained by news outlets, Nick appears devoid of urgency, a backpack slung casually over one shoulder, his face a mask of blank, impenetrable calm. There was no sign of a man on the run, no darting eyes scanning for police sirens, only the steady, unhurried gait of a person who had seemingly severed all connection to the horrific reality he had left behind in Brentwood. The most disturbing chapter of this escape unfolded inside a brightly lit gas station convenience store. Under the harsh, buzzing hum of fluorescent lights, Nick Reiner, a man who had allegedly just butchered the two people who brought him into this world, stood in line like any other customer. He didn't pace or tremble. He simply selected a bottle of sports drink, waited his turn, and paid. This mundane transaction becomes nightmarish when viewed through the lens of context. It was a display of emotional numbness so profound that it suggests a complete psychological dissociation. He stood there surrounded by the banal commerce of everyday life, while the blood of his parents was likely still fresh in his mind, if not on his hands. When he walked back out onto the street, his expression remained empty, his gaze fixed on nothingness. When the inevitable moment of capture arrived, Nick did not react with the fight-or-flight instinct of a trapped criminal. He did not run, he did not scream, and he did not struggle. As officers swarmed in, forcing him face down onto the pavement and restraining his hands behind his back, Nick was strangely subdued. He accepted his arrest with a disturbing resignation, as if the handcuffs were not a punishment, but merely the next expected stop on a path he had already accepted. In those final moments of freedom, his silence was dense and oppressive, leaving investigators and the public alike to wonder what kind of mind can navigate the ordinary world with such terrifying composure immediately after crossing the ultimate moral boundary. To understand how a son becomes the architect of his own parents' destruction, we must look beyond the crime scene and into the shattered landscape of Nick Reiner's mind, a place where reality had long since begun to distort. While prosecutors prepared charges of first-degree murder, a devastating revelation emerged from the shadows. For years, Nick had been fighting a losing battle against schizophrenia, a severe and relentless mental disorder characterized by hallucinations, delusions, and a fracturing of the self. This was not a sudden onset of madness, but a slow, agonizing erosion. His mother, Michelle, had confided in friends with growing desperation, revealing that despite their immense wealth, they were powerless against the chemistry of their son's brain. In a cruel twist of fate, it appears that the very attempt to save him may have precipitated the fall. Just 3 to 4 weeks before the murders, doctors had reportedly adjusted his antipsychotic medication. It is a known and terrifying risk in psychiatry that altering the delicate chemical balance of a schizophrenic patient can sometimes trigger a catastrophic destabilization, and for Nick, this change seemingly pushed him off the precipice, turning his behavior erratic, dangerous, and unrecognizable. But mental illness was only one head of the hydra consuming Nick Reiner. The other was a voracious, decades-long addiction that had haunted him since he was 15. Born into the lap of luxury, Nick's life paradoxically veered into the gritty darkness of homelessness, drifting through Maine, New Jersey, and Texas like a weary shadow unable to find a foothold in existence. Rob Reiner spared no expense paying upwards of $70,000 a month for high-end dual diagnosis facilities to treat the tangled roots of psychosis and substance abuse, yet the cycle remained unbroken. There is a painful, unspoken hypothesis that hangs over this tragedy, that in those final weeks, Nick may have quietly relapsed inside the Brentwood mansion, hiding his drug use in a state of terrified desperation. He knew that a relapse could mean the slamming of the final door eviction from his parents' home and a return to the streets. This fear likely forced him to live 2 parallel lives, the obedient son trying to appear recovering, and the tortured addict suffocating under the weight of his own secrets. It was a psychological pressure cooker, with the paranoia of schizophrenia amplifying the shame of addiction, creating a toxicity that eventually poisoned his entire world. In this light, the tragedy was not necessarily born of pure malice, but of a human being exhausted to the point of collapse, trapped in a golden cage where the walls were closing in, and the only way out in his deluded mind was total annihilation. Now the narrative shifts from the blood-stained silence of the Brentwood mansion to the sterile, high-stakes arena of the courtroom, where the final act of this tragedy will be written, not in violence, but in legal argument. Nick Reiner is being represented by Alan Jackson, a titan of criminal defense, known for his aggressive tactics and astronomical fees. This choice of counsel has sparked a firestorm of speculation regarding a grim financial paradox with the Slayer statute, prohibiting a murderer from inheriting their victim's wealth, who is footing the bill. Whether it is the quiet support of his grieving siblings or a trust fund from his legendary grandfather, the irony is palpable. The fortune that failed to cure Nick is now being burned to save him from the consequences of his own actions. The defense strategy is already taking shape, moving away from a denial of the act itself and toward a much more complex and difficult battlefield, the mind. Jackson is expected to mount a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, arguing that, in the terrifying darkness of that morning, Nick was not a criminal, making a choice, but a passenger in a broken mind, completely detached from reality and moral comprehension. However, the path to such a verdict is treacherous, the law is unforgiving, and the burden of proof is immense. Prosecutors will likely point to the Conan O'Brien party, the calm purchase of the sports drink, and the sheer physical control required to commit the murders as evidence of a mind that, however troubled, still retained functionality and awareness. As the next hearing approaches on January 7, 2026, the public is left suspended in a heavy, unsettling space between the black and white letter of the law and the gray, murky depths of mental illness. This trial will be more than just a judgment of Nick Reiner. It will be a profound inquisition into the limits of parental love and the terrifying realization that sometimes, despite money, fame, and the best doctors in the world, we cannot save the people we love from the demons that live inside them. We are left staring at a portrait of a family that had everything yet lost it all in a single night of madness, forcing us to ask, was this a crime of evil, or was it the inevitable tragic collapse of a human soul that had been cracking for years? The gavel has yet to fall, but the silence left behind by Rob and Michelle Reiner is already deafening.